Hello ladies and gentlemen and welcome back to my channel. Before you start with my story, remember don't be a fool, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, it's cool.
A true crime story, girl orphaned at sea, captain's murderous rampage claims entire family. For many years, Arthur Dupperault had been captivated by the idea of taking his family on a sailing adventure in the tropical waters. As he gazed out at the cold blue waters of Lake Michigan, the optometrist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, reminisced about the warmer seas he had sailed during World War II. And often spoke of his desire to spend a year living on a sailboat, traveling to different islands around the world. In 1961, Dupperault had finally become financially successful enough to make his dream a reality. Instead of braving another harsh Wisconsin winter, he, his wife Jean, their son Brian, 14, and their daughters Terry Jo, 11, and Renee, 7, decided to spend a week sailing in the Bahamas. They planned to try out life at sea on a chartered yacht, and if all went well, extend their sabbatical. The family arrived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they rented the Bluebell, a two-masted sailboat, and hired Julian Harvey, a former Air Force fighter pilot and experienced sailor, to be their captain. Harvey's wife Dean would also be joining the group on their cruise. On the morning of Wednesday, November 8, 1961, the Dupperault family eagerly boarded the Bluebell to start their voyage. The ship's 115 horsepower Chrysler engine hummed as Captain Harvey navigated the boat away from the dock, with wisps of exhaust trailing behind. As the sails were filled, the Bluebell seemed to soar as it glided out of the dark waters of the harbor and into the open sea. Finally reaching the deep blue of the Gulf Stream, a powerful ocean current that flows between Florida and the Bahamas. As they looked ahead, the Dupperaults could see the 700 islands of the Bahamas archipelago. Bathed in the sun-drenched seas of the 100,000 square miles, this was the realization of Arthur Dupperault's dream of a family adventure. Over the next 4 days, Captain Harvey navigated the Bluebell eastwards, towards the Bimini Island chain, and then further east to Sandy Point, a village on the southwestern tip of Great Abaco Island. The group spent the week snorkeling and collecting shells on the white and pink sandy beaches. On Sunday, Dupperault and the Harveys visited the office of Sandy Point Village Commissioner Roderick W. Pinder to complete the forms for leaving the Bahamas and returning to the United States. Dupperault told Pinder, "This has been a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. We'll be back before Christmas." That evening, Dean prepared dinner of chicken cacciatore and salad, which turned out to be the final meal on the Bluebell. Around 9 p.m., Terry Jo went below deck to her sleeping quarters in a small cabin at the back of the boat. Renee normally slept there, but that night she stayed with her parents and brother on the deck in the cockpit. In the middle of the night, Terry Jo was awakened by her brother's screams, "Help, Daddy! Help!" She also heard some brief running and stamping noises, then silence. She lay in her bed, trembling, confused and scared. After about 5 minutes, Terry Jo came out of her cabin. She saw her mother and brother lying in a pool of blood in the main cabin, which was used as a kitchen and dining room during the day, and as a bedroom at night. She knew immediately that they were dead. Slowly, Terry Jo climbed the stairs and peeked out of the hatch. She saw more blood pooled on the starboard side of the cockpit, and possibly a knife. She climbed on deck and turned towards the front of the boat, when suddenly Captain Harvey lunged at her and shoved her back down the stairs. "Get back down there," he snarled. With her heart pounding, Terry Jo avoided looking at her mother's and brother's bodies, and returned to her sleeping quarters, crawling back onto her bunk. She then heard sloshing sounds and soon noticed that oily-smelling water was seeping into her cabin and covering the floor. Terry Jo understood that the ship was filling with water, but she was too scared to move. Suddenly, she saw the captain's dark figure standing in the doorway of her cabin. He had something in his hands, possibly her brother's rifle, and was staring down at her. The only sounds in the room were his heavy breathing, the thundering of her heart, and the slapping of the rising water against the bulkheads. Then the captain turned and left the cabin, and she heard him climbing the stairs back to the upper deck. With water lapping over the top of her mattress, Jo knew she had to leave the cabin. Wading through waist-deep water to the stairs, she climbed to the upper deck again. From the light of a bulb on top of the boat's main mast, Jo saw that the ship's dinghy and rubber life raft were floating beside the boat on the port side. "Is the ship sinking?" she shouted out. "Yes," Harvey bellowed, coming up from behind her. He violently thrust the line to the dinghy into her hands. "Hold on to this." Numb from shock, Jo's fingers fumbled as she let the line slip through her grasp. The dinghy rapidly drifted away from the sinking Bluebell. Harvey jumped overboard with a fierce determination, swimming with all his might to catch it. Jo watched in horror as he disappeared into the dark, turbulent night. She remembered the cork life float that was kept lashed to the top right side of the main cabin, which was now barely visible above the waterline. She scrambled to the small, oblong float with a sense of urgency and quickly untied it. Just as the float came free, the boat deck beneath her feet suddenly dipped and sank into the ocean. With a desperate will to survive, she half crawled, half swam, pushing the float into the open water with all her strength. As she clambered onto the float, one of its lines snagged on the sinking ship. For a heart-stopping moment, Jo and the float were dragged underwater as the Bluebell disappeared beneath the waves. Then the line came free, and the float with Jo on it, shot back up to the surface. She huddled low on the float, fearing that the captain might be lying in wait for her in the dark and treacherous waters. With no water, no food, and nothing to protect her from the bitter cold of the night, she was completely vulnerable. The moon had set, and heavy clouds obscured the stars, leaving her in complete darkness. She could hear the howling of the wind, but see nothing. Waves broke without warning, the salt water stinging her eyes and lips. A sudden shower drenched her, and she began to shiver uncontrollably. Soon one thought consumed her mind: where is my father? The next morning, a Monday, the sun drove the chill from Jo's slender body, but she soon realized it would bring a greater danger. As the day progressed, the temperature quickly soared to 85 degrees, and the sun began to scorch her mercilessly. The flimsy float was disintegrating beneath her, leaving her legs and feet vulnerable to the sharp teeth of parrotfish. With each passing hour, her tongue became drier, her throat more parched, and her body weaker. Even so, she had no appetite and wasn't thirsty. On Tuesday, a small red plane circled overhead. She watched it and waved at it for a long time with her blouse. At one point, it dived in her direction. She waved frantically, her heart pounding with hope. The plane passed directly over her, close enough that she could see the details of its underside but at an angle that made it impossible for the pilots to see her. The chances were slim that someone in a passing ship or plane would spot Jo. Her white float and blouse and blonde hair blended in with the whitecaps of the sea, making her almost invisible. She was drifting in the treacherous northwest Providence Channel, which soon would drift north with the Gulf Stream and then east, carrying her across the wide Atlantic to the British Isles. Each passing moment was a test of survival, and she knew that her fate was in the hands of fate. Early that afternoon, Jo saw ghostly shapes about 30 yards from her float, just beneath the water's surface. Her heart raced with fear. The shapes came closer, and she could see they were porpoises. They stared up at her with large, dark eyes. Jo felt oddly comforted by the whooshing sounds the creatures made as they came to the surface to breathe. She said a little prayer of thanks to God for sending them. They remained close by for hours. As the piercing sun broke through the clouds in the late afternoon, Jo splashed some water over her scorched, tightened skin. The cool forests of Wisconsin and the cold waters of Green Bay seemed like a distant memory. The sun dropped and finally sank below the horizon. Tuesday night brought back the awful unknown in the darkness, but it also brought blessed relief to her body. As the float rose and fell on the waves that cold third night, she dreamed that she was in the cockpit of an airliner coming in for a landing. She saw the long, straight, converging lines of iridescent landing lights standing out with surreal brilliance against a fathomless, flowing blackness. The dream gave her hope, and she knew that she had to hold on to that hope, for it may just be her only way to survive. As the day progressed, the waves grew more ferocious, crashing against her fragile raft and threatening to engulf her at any moment. The sun beat down mercilessly, sapping her strength and leaving her on the brink of collapse. But Jo refused to give up, summoning every ounce of willpower she had left to cling to the raft and fight for survival. With no food or water, and her body racked with pain and exhaustion, she was pushed to the brink of collapse. But she refused to give up, her determination to see her family again driving her forward. As nightfall approached, she saw a ship on the horizon and mustered all her strength to wave and shout for help. With her last bit of energy, she clung to her raft as it was tossed around by the tempestuous sea, her heart racing with hope as the ship drew closer. Will she make it and survive, or will the sea claim her? Only time will tell. With her last ounce of strength, Jo opened her eyes to the looming shadow before her. The sound of a powerful engine rumbled in her chest as the shadow transformed before her eyes, from an otherworldly vessel floating above the sea to a massive whale and finally, a solid black wall suspended in the air. She looked up to the top of the wall, where she saw heads and arms waving frantically. She could barely hear the voices shouting her name. Suddenly, she felt herself being lifted up and pulled to safety. As she was pulled from the brink of death, she slipped into unconsciousness. When Julian Harvey was hired as the captain of the Bluebell, little was known about his past. The 44-year-old was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and married to Mary Dean Jordan, an aspiring writer and former TWA flight attendant. But the day after the Bluebell vanished, a lookout on a tanker bound for Puerto Rico spotted a small wooden dinghy drifting in the middle of the vast and treacherous Northwest Providence Channel. As the captain pulled the tanker closer, a man in the dinghy shouted out, "My name is Julian Harvey. I am the captain of the Bluebell." In the days that followed, Harvey told the Coast Guard in Miami that he was the only survivor of a tragic accident. According to Harvey, a sudden squall had struck the sailboat in the middle of the night, causing damage to the vessel. He said that his wife, Dean, and the Dupperaults were injured when the masts and rigging collapsed. The ship caught fire as gas lines in the engine room ruptured, causing it to slowly sink. Harvey claimed that he had managed to launch the dinghy and raft and dive overboard, but that tangled rigging trapped the others on board. The truth behind the Bluebell tragedy began to unravel when Julian Harvey was found dead in his hotel room. The police discovered that he had taken his own life, leaving behind a trail of blood and lies. According to Jo's account, Harvey had brutally killed her family and Dean Harvey in a twisted scheme to collect money from her life insurance. As the sole survivor of the massacre, she was rescued by the Greek freighter Captain Theo and taken to a Miami hospital where she recounted the horrific events that had occurred on the Bluebell. Despite the traumatic events, Jo, now known as Tyr, emerged from the tragedy determined to make something positive out of her experience. She went on to write the book Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean, in the hopes that it would help others who have faced similar tragedy. As she said in an interview with CBS News,
"I always believed I was saved for a reason. If one person heals from a life tragedy after reading my story, my journey will have been worth it."
Thanks for watching my video, hoped you enjoyed it. See you in the next episode.